Well, actually, my connection with Lama goes back before I ever came to Lama, because that was in the end of the 60s. And I had heard about and started going to Ramdas lectures, and started hearing more and more about Lama. And then through a series of circumstances, got the book Seed and started reading Seed, and felt compelled to get in touch with because there was no author, whoever had written Seed. And the only address I could find in the book at all was Lama, and I'd heard about Lama, so we wrote Lama and to the author of Seed. And so for a period of about, I guess, at least a year, we had a correspondence going with the so-called quote-unquote author of Seed, but the letters were never signed, so we never knew who it was that was writing to us. And so this went on for some time, and I figured, because in the back of Seed there are all these pictures, I figured somewhere in those pictures was the person I was communicating with. So I sat down with that whole spread of pictures and just went through each one, well, of people, and tried to get a hit. And if I remember right, it was number 96A that I finally got, and I said, "Yep, this is the person." And so I wrote the next letter to 96A. Turned out that 96A was Asha, and as a result of that, all of a sudden the nature of the correspondence began to change, and was invited to come. So I was working in Hollywood in those days, and very, very high pressure situation, and it was very difficult to get away. But finally figured out a way to take about a week off and come to Lama. And of course we didn't know where it was, except that it was somewhere around San Cristobal in New Mexico. So at that time I was married and had a family, and so we came out in a station wagon and got to Taos very late in the afternoon, and got to San Cristobal, just at dusk as the sun was setting, and started driving back those dusty roads in San Cristobal, trying to find the Lama Foundation. And practically everyone we talked to either spoke Spanish only or wouldn't talk to us at all. And so we're winding around those mountain roads trying to find our way here. And about midnight, we finally got here. We went to what was the Divine Light Mission down the road. That was, at that time, the young boy Guru Maharaji. And there were some people there, and they said, "Well, we'll tell you how to get there, but if you shouldn't go because they're going to throw you off the mountain. They won't let you just drive up and come." Well, this was really encouraging at about 11 o'clock at night after having driven for 1,000 miles, but we decided we'd do it anyway. So we finally pulled up in our car to the kitchen, and there were a couple of gas lights on. And this guy comes out, his very long beard, very long hair. His name was Dharmadipo. And so the first person I saw at Lama was Dharmadipo. And told him who I was, and he said, he says, "Asha's at her house, we'll take you over there." And so we got out of the car, and of course it's the middle of the night, and he doesn't have a flashlight, and he says, "You don't need a light." And so four of us are stumbling through the path down by the garden up to what was the tower at that time. And so we finally met Asha at that time. Well, it turned out there were only about 3 people here when we got here, because there was a plague of hepatitis. And everybody was sick and in the hospital. And there was no one on the land, and everyone was very suspicious of the water, and it was a big mess. And so that was my first introduction to Lama.
What year was this?
This was late summer 1974. And so it became clear, even after, Asha was welcoming and all of that, but it became clear that we shouldn't stay because it was a bad situation. So we packed everything up and left and visited some friends in Taos. But now we had some contact with some people, and so our correspondence continued, and later that year, Nuruddin, who was Steve Durkee, came to visit us where we were living in Southern California. And of course told us, you know, that he was the primary person that we had been corresponding with. And Asha had told us that before. And so we started, especially I started a relationship with Steve in terms of Sufi practices and things of that sort. And so it must have been around November that Steve came and gave me my first Sufi initiation. And Shaida was with him, and she basically invited us to come to Lama. And of course, at that time, it just wasn't in the cards for us to leave. So I said, well, no way, it's impossible. I'm in the middle, I'm working, you know, I'm a producer, I've got all these projects going, and I can't possibly come to Lama. And to be honest, I wasn't sure I wanted to from what I had seen of it. You know, and it was very interesting to talk to them and to share on that level and to know that Ram Dass was connected and all of that. But the reality of leaving a high-paying job in the middle of the city, uprooting everything and coming to this God knows where in northern New Mexico was rather awesome. So we just said no. A month later, all the projects, without exception, that I was working on failed. I was out of a job in a month. And so I went on unemployment, which you do in the film industry when projects stop. And so I dragged it out a couple more months, but nothing was happening, absolutely nothing. And finally, Shaida came back through again and said, you've got to come to Lama. At that point, see, that we had nothing else. And so we said, okay, we'll come to Lama. And knowing almost nothing about it. So we essentially gave away almost everything we had because we couldn't bring it to Lama. And, you know, so we throw our few possessions in the car and drive out here. And this was very early March, I think, if I remember right. It was very cold. And we get here, and they're starting what was called the spring meeting. That was our first initiation of spring meetings. Well, they had been having some difficulty that year, and so part of what the spring meeting was about was getting rid of about 2/3 of the people who were living here, and bringing in a few new people. In this case, people, most of them had never even seen before, and pretty much Steve was calling the shots. And they had this idea for a summer of workshops. Lama had never had workshops up to then. And so we came in and were introduced and you know, met a bunch of people, and they said, well, your turn will come, you know, to see if you can get consensus to stay. And so we said, okay. And so the next day the meeting started, and the meetings went 8 days. Something on the order of 8 or 10 hours a day for 8 days in a row. And our coming up for consensus came on the 8th day. And we're watching, and we sit in on these meetings all day long. Of course, we were new to consensus and all of this sort of thing. It was mind-boggling. But we're seeing all these people getting tossed off the mountain, and we're asking to come. And it was a very strange kind of position to be in, because we, you know, seemed kind of odd. But the 8th day comes, and he says, you know, and we basically, Steve and Shaida said, we want these people to stay, and we got consensus for whatever that meant.
Like the chosen people?
That's right, although for what, we weren't sure. And then at that point, we started planning the first summer seminar schedule, workshop schedule, and very high-powered summer, because it had Ram Dass and Hari Das, Zalman Shakhtar, Pir Vilayat. It was a mime.
Samuel Avital.
Samuel Avital, that's right. And it seemed to me there was somebody else that summer, but it was a very, very big summer. And so we immediately started planning, because there was nothing here. There were no picnic tables, there was no dorm tent, no campgrounds. Lama had never done any of that before. And there was no water reservoir. The only thing we had was that little redwood reservoir up there. And we as we started planning for this, like we had 250 people signed up for Pir Vilayat's camp and had no accommodations at all. And so we were faced from a period of, toward the end of March, Pir Vilayat's camp was in the 1st of June. We basically had April and May to do everything. And so it was one incredible boogie trying to put everything together. And at the same time, we're doing zikr every night, and and the whole thrust of spiritual practice was very, very heavy duty. I mean, this was not a place to come, just to be a carpenter or hang out. I mean, so everything you were doing, started with practice and ended with practice. And the sits at that time, the morning sit began at 5 o'clock. And you sat from 5 to 6. And it was very, because it, I guess, was coming out of the Zen tradition. But we would go in there. It was very, you're all bundled up in all your clothes and everything, and you sit down, and of course you're wearing a down jacket or something like that. So it was very interesting training because, if you moved and your jacket rustled, there'd be this loud slam, quiet, and you couldn't move at all. You couldn't make a sound. If you sneezed, you had to leave. Or sniffed if you had sniffles. So, we're saying, wow, what is this? And so that was our introduction to the spiritual aspect of Lama. And it got worse. I mean, it didn't get better. That summer was incredibly intense.
Wow.
And so that's sort of the story of how I arrived here. And then, I spent a little over a year as a resident here. And then I've come back summer after summer. Most of the summers, I missed a few. So, would you, I don't know really where to go from here.
Yeah, let's go to Pat and get her history, and
Okay.
then you can go back and forth.
Well, actually, Amin's time frame was our first initiation with Lama, too. We had moved to Amalia, New Mexico in fall of '74 to
Right.
caretake a ranch. And we came one Sunday to visit
That's
with
right.
people from Amalia who knew about the place. And so we knew about Lama, but that was about it. There was no more, there wasn't this pull to come here or anything like that. But then in sometime in '75, one of our kids, our 5th daughter, Beth Ann, heard about Donna Hosley's school. And we had our kids out of school. And so she became interested in getting back into school, went down to TAS, interviewed with Amin, and really wanted to go to this school. In the meantime, Sarah, another daughter, who was brain injured, was accepted through a program that came out of Philadelphia, which required that we go to Philadelphia twice a year for a week, which it prompted us to move from New Mexico and to move to a place that would be within driving distance of Philadelphia. And that led to Beth Ann asking Amin about the possibility of staying on when we moved. And so she moved right in with their family in '75. And actually, Mirabad was living with you
Right.
guys, Beth Ann was living, plus your own 2 kids.
Right.
And so that was our initiation into Lama, and somehow or another, the Lama Foundation and what it was about stuck in the back of our head for a later time, because we were doing our boogie with daughter Sarah from 76 to 82. And in '82, we were totally burnt out on Sarah's program. The whole family was burnt out, and we decided at that time we remembered Lama. And so we made plans to, first of all, visit Lama and see what it was like in '82. And so Bob came down actually in October of '81 and looked over the place and really felt very, very strongly that that this was the place for us. As a matter of fact, Bob landed here on the day that everything was over for the beans for the summer workshops, and they were all taken off on a hike up the mountain. And so, you know, he came and no one was going to be here. So graciously they invited him to go along on this top of the mountain hike wherever they went. And he ended up carrying Amina for Yukari, who was a baby.
Right.
And he was patient enough to wait out. Most of the beans at that time were burnt out from the summer program, and their attitude was, stay away from me. I don't want to talk to you, I don't want anything to do with you, you know. But he was patient enough to wait that out, and finally had a really good hit from some of the beans that he did talk to. Mary Ann Matheson in particular, Yukari, Andy Starr, and particularly Meek and Latifah. And had long conversations with Mika and Latifah, who were interested in getting a family here, and someone with family background. So we came here in May of '82, and we're here for 2.5 years, and on the earth level plane, I was serving as treasurer and cook and canner, I guess.
Right. You were kitchen master, it seemed like forever.
And Bob was serving as construction master, and it's interesting for me to come back and look at the places that his hands touched that are still here. I mean, the prayer room roof, and the floor in the shower room, and the redwood shower bench, and the ISC dome, and the screen doors, and the skylights in the ISC. And I realized that he really left concrete evidence of his being here, and I really didn't. I didn't leave any concrete evidence, other than maybe writing the Idiot Guide to the Treasury. But for us, it's the knowledge that there is this space existing here for people like us to move through and grow, and then take that back out into the world.
Yeah.
Right. That's for sure.
And that is a sacred, safe space that maybe does not exist anywhere else in the world, as far as I know.
Well, it is a place of refuge. I mean,
Yeah.
you know.
And respite.
Yeah.
Respite. Yeah.
Because I think that most people come here, don't even know why. Very few people, I think, that come to stay here know when they first come that that's
What
what's
they're
going to
getting
happen.
into.
Right.
Yeah.
That
It's true.
that they get here and all of a sudden it's just impossible to leave on some level or other. And a lot of the people who come intending to be here never make it. You know, it doesn't work out. So it's a very interesting kind of thing that happens. But I don't know, you know, after having been here and coming back over 15, 16 years, you know, you meet so many people. And I mean, just in terms of the beings themselves, you know, like today when you see the circle with all the people, and of course all those faces remind you of at least an equal number of faces that have sat around that circle over the years. And that's not to mention campers. I mean, how many hundreds of thousands of campers do you see, you know, during a stay at Lama? And you know, and that all of that's significant. You know, we sometimes think that you know, you come here and you're at Lama and it's for you. And you can't help but feel that a little bit. And yet you think in terms of just the hundreds of people that you're with over the course of however long you're here, and some of the maybe insignificant connections or conversations you have go off the mountain with those people and then circle around, and years later people will bump into you and say, you know, that conversation we had in the kitchen that night
Mhm.
changed my life.
Yeah.
And you know, you're sitting there trying to remember, which one was that, you know? Because you do it, I mean, it's just so much a part of being here. And it's not that you're insensitive to that person, it's just that there's so many that they tend to blend together. You know, and that's a kind of service that I think this place serves that doesn't get much recognition. We get camps recognition and that sort of thing. But, you know, just those nights sitting up in the dining room drinking tea with some traveler passing through may be as important as some of the flashier stuff
Yeah.
that Lama does.
Well, it's interesting because to me that's, you know, although the stated purpose of being here at the foundation is to increase not only individual consciousness but all consciousness, and that the vehicle for that happening is through the spiritual practice. That's what's put out. But and in actual fact, the spiritual practice is what facilitates what happens in community, which is, as far as I'm concerned, the real glue of this place, which is the bonding of the people that live together and the intimacy, which seems to be, to me, as far as I can determine, the search of every human being alive. That search is for that intimacy. And so the spiritual practice is sort of like a tool
Right.
and the channel for the bonding of community, and that, you know, because you aren't going to find this being a hermit.
No.
All you're doing is rubbing up against yourself, and so there's no friction. There's not that viable tension that forces you to move and adjust and grow. And
Well, and the notion of a pressure cooker, I mean,
Yeah.
this place
Right.
has been, you know, that's the
Yeah.
analogy that's used all the time.
uh,
You get cooked being here.
right,
Right.
the fire.
Partly, yeah,
the
because
fire.
you don't know the kind of baggage and stuff you're bringing with you when you first come here. I mean, you have some ideas about who you are and what you're going to do and all that kind of stuff.
How
but
special you are.
That's right,
Mhm.
and it doesn't take very long before you begin to say, "What am I doing here?" You know,
Right.
and you know, it gets very intense.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you're supported in that.
Uh-huh.
I mean, sometimes you may not know it, but you are.
Mhm.
And the community of beings that are going through that with you and have gone through it before or after you is like a continuum.
Mhm.
And that notion of pressure cooker, to get done with your stuff, you know, to cook those uncooked seeds, as Rumi would say, you know, to get done with your personal ego trips on some level, and it's just facilitated in a place like this.
Yeah, it's a container. It's a safe container for that to happen, and it's encouraged to happen.
Do you guys have any funny stories or any kind of, you know, memorable events that you wouldn't want lost from the annals of Lama history? I'm going to pause for a minute.
Well, I can think of one funny story. Well, I probably can think of a lot more, but I can think of one particular. There's always great fire danger at Lama, you know, especially in the summertime when everything dries out. And so we have the bells, and, you know, we have the fire bell up by the garage. I don't know if you still do, but we used to have packs filled with water cans, filled with water that, you know, you'd run and grab and run to wherever the fire was. Well, that, in between two camps that summer, I think I was up working on the reservoir, and I hear the fire bell starting to ring. And so, you know, you just drop everything and run, which I did. And I come running down, and here's this guy, this stranger, standing there by the bell, going bang, bang, bang. And right behind me, on one side was Siddiq, and on the other side was Nuruddin. Right, you know, we arrived almost instantly, and I looked at the guy, and I says, "Where's the fire?" And the guy looked up at us, and he says, "It's in my heart."
Such a Lama story.
Really. And Siddiq grabs him by one elbow, and Nuruddin grabbed him by the other elbow, and they just picked him up and just walked him down and said, Well, you come back when there are no more fires going. But it had the whole mountain in a panic for a while.
Really?
You have a funny story?
Mm-mm.
Mm-mm.
I mean, I know there were hundreds of them with Amma the Bomina, but I can't think of them right now.
How does Lama seem to you now? I mean, or the evolution over the years since you've been here? What perceptions do you see, changes, transformations?
Well, I think one thing, I think an individual spiritual work is probably as intense as it ever was, in spite of the fact that when we were here, it had to be outwardly as intense as well as inwardly intense. But I think in some sense that was a distraction, that you were more compelled for the people here than you were for your practice. And I think what I see here is that there was a time when the practice sort of backed off for a little while, but now the people that are here seem to be very deeply in their practice. But at the same time, they are very accommodating, gentle, loving people. You know, that whether you're an old bean like me that comes back or whether you're a new person that walks up the mountain, there is a feeling of genuine kindliness at this place, which I think, you know, is so much better. And obviously there's been a lot of work on the buildings and that sort of thing. It feels so much more together on the physical plane.
Yeah.
It doesn't have that feeling, and it's about ready to fall apart at any minute. And I think the community has finally gotten to the place where they don't feel like they're running to try and catch up to keep the buildings from falling down. And I think that's great. I really like what I see.
Well, to me, everything that's happening on the physical plane is really just a reflection of what's happening internally with the people, which is that they aren't about ready to fall apart. There is a stability, and I feel very strongly, just from the 80s to the 90s, say that there's been a real growing up process take place that needed to be, because the tendency was to stay stuck in the 60s, even though it was 70s and 80s.
Right, cling to the
And
old model.
fiercely. And there was an initiation in the 80s to start taking the foundation out of its pubescence, and to have a major thrust towards that growing up and taking responsibility, and getting rid of the poverty consciousness.
Well, and getting rid of the notion of hierarchy.
Right.
Because
right.
the place was founded on a
Right.
vision of hierarchy, the spiritual hierarchy as well as the physical one. And it was so intense in that founding vision that it took years to overcome that. And there were lots of hurts and hard feelings and what have you that came out of that. And, no one, I think, would deny that the place needs leadership, but it doesn't have to be hierarchical. And, it comes from the heart and a feeling of need, and that's very different.
Lama survived the 80s.
Really?
That's a major feat.
That's true.
Relatively unscathed by then.
Well, I think the thing we all learned was that we're stable, and you can trust the people that are here. I think there was some feeling on the part of the oldest beings that, well, if we all leave, the place is going to fall apart, or it isn't going to last. And what I am so delighted about is to come back year after year and see people are people, and they can keep the trip together. They have their problems like we all do, but it does survive and it does continue, and there is that feeling of continuity. And I have this great sense of trust in the place.
That was the word that came up for me, was trust. And a lot of it has to do with sensing that the original invocation made on this place must have been very, very strong. Because obviously the energy was invoked and evoked to keep this place alive and thriving for 23 years.
Oh, I remember something else. can I say something else?
Get
I remember-
closer, pull up a chair.
I just remember, in terms of invocations, that we were going to the Native American church meetings, and we were, where you take peyote. But Steve and I had taken a vow in regards to Mayor Baba not to use any kind of drugs, and I think in terms of Herman Rednick also. So we weren't into drugs, but that was the ceremony that everybody knew. You know, there were all these sort of peyote boys, and they'd go boom, 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 and then there was cedar. So I remember Linda Brown, who was part of the kind of early New Mexico semi-hippie culture. It was a subculture there that was, I don't even know whether it was called hippie, but anyway, she went up as sort of the woman, and they drummed and sang peyote songs all night right down there in below the volleyball field. I mean, there was nothing up here except the foundation of the dome. And all night long, they stayed up and drank coffee and smoked cigarettes and had a rattle, and they had a drum and sang peyote songs. This is one of the original invocations.
Wow.
So that there was a lot of stuff like that even before we landed here.
Uh-huh.
There was a lot of preparatory things, and everybody that we met wanted to be part of this whole event,
Grab a
and
jug.
continually wanted to become until we said no drugs. And as
Right.
soon as we said no drugs, New Buffalo happened.
Mm-hmm.
Because basically all of the people who were in New Mexico who had wanted to be part of this then didn't want to do that. So New Buffalo was a result of that in a large way, according to my understanding. So I wanted to just tell you about that strong invocation, that there was a very strong movement from everybody that we met in New Mexico towards the creation of this, because it was something like, oh, I'm hungry, what will feed me?
Right.
And nobody really had an answer, and this was the most tangible answer.
Did you tell them about the winter that you and the girls spent up here in a teepee?
No, I don't remember a winter we spent in a teepee, but it was the same as a teepee. I mean, it had a fire with those uninsulated A-frames with just the wood fires that went, but it was okay. I mean, it was always okay weather-wise, except once when it's 36 below, and I had a baby on my arm and a toddler and two other kids, and we had to walk up in this 36 below morning, and everybody was in the prayer meeting, and I was very much afraid of one of them falling down. And I didn't know how, I mean, 36 below isn't that bad, but I wasn't sure at that point that if one of them fell and slipped, because it was also very icy, whether I could get the other ones up quick enough to the kitchen where it was warm and back down without that. But that was the only cold thing. You could just get used to it. Anyway, here's another beer.
Right.
Here come the trustees.
Oh, okay. All right. I first came to Lama in 1967 to visit my sister Barbara and her husband Steve. And we had visited them a lot in Garnerville, New York, and they had visited us a lot in Rochester and Boston. And we stayed for 3 days. We were on our way to California. And I spent 2 of those days working very hard making adobe bricks with Henry Gomez and Vincent, and I think a couple of other Indian men with Jonathan Altman and Steve, and I think that was about it. It was very high. There were no buildings. It was a school bus. And
Robin has a school bus that was down below.
yeah, it was up here. That was
Yeah.
the kitchen. And then the 3rd day, Barbara took us on a tour of the Pueblo. But when we drove into Taos Valley, it was like Shangri-La. It was cloudy, and it was early in the morning. And we came up here, and we saw this Coptic cross on one of the telephone poles on the dirt road. It just all was magic. So we went on to California, and as we drove down the hill, I said, "Why are we leaving?" And she said, "I don't know." So we went on to California, interacted with our families, and stopped by on the way back very briefly, and stayed at the Hawk Ranch in San Cristobal, where Dan Rudyard, it turns out, had written one of his books on astrology. The next year was '68, and we just came for 3 weeks in August, and the foundation had been incorporated then. And, I think I built the first bathhouse window. I didn't glaze it, I just built it. And that too was a rather powerful experience. Barbara and Steve had been involved in grass and LSD and all kinds of stuff, and we had never been into it. although we were curious, we'd just never done it. And we had been involved in Gurdjieff work in Rochester and Boston, and they seemed to be getting more grounded in their whatever they were doing, and this vision seemed to be one that I could relate to. And we were willing to go a little bit further out in what we were interested in. So the next summer, we decided to come for the following summer, '69, and in the meantime, I was not reappointed at Northeastern, and I was unhappy in physics, and I was underconfident in physics, and jobs were running out in physics at the time. So we came, and we didn't go back, we stayed until my marriage broke up in 1970. That's how I got here.
Uh-huh.
And so for 2 years, Francis and myself and Margaret and Kaylin were here, and in '69 Daniel was born, which was not too many months after we got here to stay. So that's my arrival.
Do you want to talk a little more about your feeling, perceptions of the place, how it was to start living here?
It was very solid, grounded vision. It was not a hippie commune, and it was very structured. You've probably heard the story before, and I'm telling it secondhand, but Herman Rednick was a meditation teacher for Steve and Barbara. And they asked him for advice, and he said, have you heard this before, or do you have this on tape?
Asha he said no drugs.
Well, he said, I can help you to form a community. And he had had some kind of utopian community in mind. He had gotten some design from one of Mr. Fuller's disciples at MIT, and they were very excited in moving their cooperative in Garnerville to here. They had about 40 people interested, and Herman Rednick said to them, look, I can help you, but I'm not interested in a utopia because it won't work. If you want a spiritual community, I can help you. And Steve tends to go whole hog on everything. And so when Herman said, well, if you want to make fast progress, you'll give up drugs. And if you want to go slower, you can continue using drugs, but it'll just take a lot longer to get where you want to be. And Steve never did anything halfway. Immediately he said no drugs. And as Asha here has said many times before, the number of interested people dropped from 40 or so to 3. Well, I liked that. I mean, and he also stressed regular meals and regular practice, and that was more in line with what I knew from what I was used to, a disciplined kind of work from my experience with the Gurdjieff people. So I've just found it very attractive. It was a very magical place, and I just felt very much at home. And I knew from 1967 on that if I never came back again, that somehow northern New Mexico in this area would be my home, even if I never saw it again.
Yeah.
I just knew that. So those are my feelings.
Uh-huh.
Don't know what else to say on that stuff.
Do you want to say anything about the transformations of Lama over the years? How you've seen it grow, evolve, change, devolve, whatever impressions you have.
I knew during those early years that it depended very much on Steve's juice. I mean, I know it relied on Barbara's as well. But I felt that its evolution would require it to be independent of any one person. And my vision included that a leadership would evolve somehow that was not dependent on any 1, 2, or 3 individuals. So I knew that sooner or later that was going to happen.
Could I intersperse something here historically, the way stuff works? Is that much earlier when Steve had been an artist moving up in the New York art scene, he had dropped out because he was really very much into anonymous art. And so we started USCO, which was an anonymous art company that went around doing kind of the early psychedelic light shows. And actually, his vision, and my vision too, had to do with something that you were talking about in terms of an anonymous societal expression that almost was a civilization rather than the expression of one particular person. And it was by virtue of our strong personalities and that didn't happen while he
That's
was
right.
here,
That's right.
but not because of the ideal. And I remember, Siddiq, when you said after he had left, what savage irony it was. You know, that he had to leave to make it actually fulfill its own dharma and what most people had seen for it.
Yeah.
You know, the vision was stronger, it seems,
Yeah.
than anybody. I mean, everybody has their own ideas about it, but
Yeah.
there's an archetype or an elemental here that's so huge, and it's been so fed by so many people throughout the world, and so many teachers and so many spiritual.
And it was his invocation. He wrote
Yes.
the bylaws.
Yes.
He invoked a New Age model of what you can call eclectic, or you can manacle the discovery of a new way. And then he later renounced that. But what he had invoked was already
It was too powerful.
much
Right.
too strong. And we were ready to abandon it ourselves as well. I mean, okay,
Uh-huh.
take it. But somehow that invocation was so strong that he simply couldn't do it either. None of us could.
It was bigger than any one
It
person.
had a life of its own.
I would like to do a little bit of a Lama invocation now because Miriam, if you don't mind, and this is how things happen here, so you might as well get it on tape. Miriam said
Artistic
over
liberty.
breakfast that one of the things she felt was that in terms of the coordinator, that there was never a really formal investment of the coordinator. And I thought, wow, that is absolutely true. When I was
Yeah.
coordinator, I'm sure when you were, if somebody had actually empowered me, it would have been better. So I said, oh good, I love thinking up rituals, and I remembered that this was in the fireplace and that for her to have charge of this and to talk, for us to talk. So I thought the
First thing this morning.
trustees this
Good.
morning could
Good.
stand up, and then the four officers and Miriam, and that I would like to hand it to her because I thought of it. I got that. But that if each trustee would just say something to her and to all of them,
Excellent.
and then we could invest them,
I
okay?
remember we did NIOS for a couple of
Yeah.
officers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They had their
We've
meetings,
always
right.
done.
Well, we could do that also, it's always fun.
Okay.
Or deep.
Okay, well, let's get
Okay.
back to the subject.
Okay. Yeah,
Which has to
anyway,
do
so
with
now
the
that I
Lama
have gotten
archives.
permission.
Yes, you have
Yes.
permission.
You can stay, Asha.
I know, but I have 3 phone calls.
Okay.
Um,
Well,
Yeah, so that invocation was much more powerful than I think I think somehow I understood that there was an invocation, and it was almost like a child that Steve had given birth to, and that later as Nuruddin, he had terrific ambivalent feelings about it, really renounced, and he couldn't do it. The child was grown up by then.
right.
Well, that may have been part of the problem with the ISC, because he kind of invested that with a different energy. And there was that kind of polarization for those years between this side of the mountain and that side of the mountain. And that was more his personal thing rather than the more universal thing that I feel at Lama.
I'd like to ask Sakina about her experiences coming up the mountain, how it happened for you.
Oh, I came here in June 1974 from Northern California, having spent the 3 years before that very much at the disciple of Pure Reliance, working really almost exclusively on the inner planes as developing a form that would work for me so that I could survive in the world. And I really credit Pure Vilayat and Rashad in a lot of ways for saving my life, literally. it was that deep of an experience. You know, I followed him to Chamonix and Woodstock and Mendocino and spent all the time with him that I could. Studied music with Aladdin and really immersed myself. At that time there was just one large Sufi community in Northern California, of which Shirin was one of the shining stars. A great inspiration.
You're projecting.
No,
Not
well,
that much,
maybe we all projected. How about that? Yes, there was a lot of projection going on all the way around.
All the way around.
And it was wonderful and terrible. The third year, well, no, actually the second year at that time, I met Shaida and Nuruddin, who were putting together Toward the One, a book of Pierce, an enormous book of Pierce's work, and started working with them. They taught me how to do graphics work, and we became very close friends. And they were both nocturnal people. So we did a lot of work late at night that would evolve into conversations about winters at Lama and what the essence of Lama was about. So my introduction to Lama was mainly through Shaida's eyes. Then the year after that, I moved from Marin County to San Francisco and spent a year living there in a household where many Lama people landed when they came to San Francisco, including Bhagwan Das and his wife and their daughter, and Surya and Sarada and their daughter. And it was a very crazy year in San Francisco. It was the year of the Patty Hearst kidnapping and the zebra killings. There was a killer who, we opened the paper one morning, and there was this guy going around killing young women, and the pattern, there were like 6 of them that he had killed, and they formed a ring around her house. So by that May, Surya had invited me to come to Lama to help put together In the Garden, a book of Merchant Sands work, and I said, sure, I'd love to come. So I got here, I was invited to stay for a month, and got here, and they were nowhere near ready to start this book. There wasn't the manpower, there wasn't the intention of even what the book should be. And the community was it was in transition, though when I arrived I didn't know it was in transition, it just was what it was. I spent a fair amount of time smoking grass with Abdullah and Surya, and just kind of hanging out, you know. I talked with Abdullah yesterday, reminding him of those days we were in theory mudding the dome. He doesn't remember anything about it yet. It was all kind of like that.
You organized the collation.
Well, right. After I'd been here
Harvest.
for 2 weeks, Siddiq came to the business meeting looking completely freaked out and saying, we've taken on this enormous project. We're,
I don't remember that.
right, you did. And they were putting out the Yellow Book, the first edition, which was loose, unbound sheets. I forget if there were 70 or 110 pages.
108 or something.
Huge,
Yeah.
huge number of loose pages.
Sayings of Haridas Baba.
And there were 10,000 copies that we were supposed to collate by hand and keep clean, and then put these yellow wrappers around and tie bows around them. 10,000 of them. And this was this community that was sitting around smoking dope and, you know, pretending we were mudding the dome. So,
I wasn't.
so no, you weren't there. He was running around looking harried, and his second marriage was sort of rocky.
Falling apart,
Yes.
ending.
He was in heartbreak and great distress. And we were not helping at all. Well, we could. Anyway, I got recruited as sort of a naive neophyte to organize this project. So for the next 2.5 weeks, the entire community, everyone who was here, worked in the dome. We set up workstations with 10 pages on each. Incredible amounts of boxes. And no one could walk in the dome unless they had washed their hands. And I organized this project, and it was really my first experience of what I was able to do in the world. And that was the first and one of the most lasting gifts that Lama gave me, and understanding that I had unique skills, and I could get a group of people to work together harmoniously without them realizing that I was exerting my authority. Yeah.
The skill to which Sakina excels.
That's
Well, I've taken that and used it ever since. You know, and it's kind of an elusive inner kind of skill that I'm very thankful to have had a situation where I could discover it. You know, and living in community for me was a real eye-opener to the way the world worked. I had no idea that there were people for whom it was a struggle to pick up their bath towels from the washroom floor, you know, because I always took organization for granted. So for me, I could see how I fit in and could be useful in the world, which up till then I had no idea of. So I guess it was the beginning of my self-worth. Yeah.
Well, you took over BLDS about that time, too.
After that, I ended up with BLDS. Yeah. Yeah.
I'll ask you also about your perceptions of Lama over the years, growing, changing, evolving, up to the present, if you wish.
Well, later that summer, Ramdas came and looked at the state that Lama was in. You guys should really get it together, you know. Just Be Here Now money is not going to keep coming forever. And you have enough people here with enough juice, if you would get it together, to lead camps. And he offered to come the following summer, you know, helping us come up with an alternative means of support for the foundation. So that was the beginning of the summer program. And we had a walking program the following summer. Pirvalaya and Haridas, Shmuel, Avital, and Zalman, and Ramdas and his whole crazy crew.
At Pirvalaya.
Yeah. And that, you know, most of the large changes that I saw in the years that I was here were ideas, seeds that Ramdas planted. The more formal organization, more business-like view of the cottage industries was his idea too, from an annual meeting a couple of years after that. You know, when there was this talk yesterday about negative reaction to large Anglo males with resonant voices. You know, my memories are more than balanced out by people like Ramdas and Wali Ali, who were here with vision, and Siddiq too. You know, who put out their vision in such a positive, loving way to really direct this foundation.
Yeah, white Anglo males, I think, if women have been wounded, they've been wounded by white Anglo males, black males, Hispanic males, Oriental males and everything else. I think that white Anglo is getting a bum rap.
Yeah.
It's way beyond
Short and
European
tall.
Well,
culture.
we're also being wounded by our own inner males.
Mhm. Good point.
Until we cop to that and acknowledge that it's easy when you turn the negative animus. I'm struggling this whole weekend with mine again. He appears regularly.
Well,
and
since
it
the
gives
cameras.
me a hard time. So,
Yeah.
And everyone takes the idea that it's all done with mirrors. Then Steve Durkee was me. Certainly represented a part of me that was out of control in a certain sense. Very strong, positive in another sense, but had that dichotomy, or I wouldn't have been so attracted to the whole
I
situation.
think that's true
Right.
of almost everyone here.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess that's something I was reminded when, at one point, in your anger, you referred to him as a fascist, and I thought that was harsh. And then I remembered an essay by Ignacio Zalone about communism. He had been a former communist and had worked in the resistance during World War II. And he pointed out that fascism had emotional roots in a longing for a mythical golden age of stability and a certain serenity. It didn't matter that most people in the fascist leadership were corrupt and self-serving. The spiritual aspiration was there, which happened to be a deceptive illusion. And he was obviously, and may still be, longing for a harmony and a stability, which this crazy world, particularly being a Western civilization, seems to be incapable of.
Yeah.
Period. And so,
It's certainly part of my own psychology.
and we all long for it.
Sure.
So I think part of what he was doing was going for it for broke, and there was a funny distortion, and there was a funny wrongness to it. But I can understand that longing that motivated it.
He also understood Machiavelli quite well. So one of our first conversations was a conversation about Machiavelli's theories of political persuasion. And as a matter of fact, I was quite impressed during our conversation, because I thought his understanding of people was quite good, and it was good enough in some way so that it fit into one of my early fantasy that I was going to have 15 children, place them strategically around the world, and somehow fill them with all the wisdom of the ages and put them in political positions. So his total understanding of Machiavelli, not the underside of it, which is objective and has a certain air of cruelty if you're a humanist, but the other end of it was very attractive to me. So I'm sure that operated because it was deep in him too. All to serve the vision.
The whole thing has been, for me, a fascinating study in power and control. And,
I went
sort of my,
through-
how it relates to me.
One of the harder sides of my experience is here I am living in this community with my big sister. And,
No
and it's-
longer.
And it's like, Steve is my big brother. I mean, he's 6 months younger than I am, but he was functioning as my big brother. And then my wife, who's a powerful woman also. And I remember Jonathan Altman saying to me one time in the kitchen, says, "Well, it's interesting because you're not on any power trips, but Francis and Stephen and Barbara are all on power trips, and you're kind of unique in this situation." And I'm feeling, oh my God,
What's a nice boy like you doing?
in a place like this. He didn't say that, but that would have been a wonderful articulation of how I felt. I was reminded of that because your fantasy about children.
Right. Oh yeah. I mean, I've
Machiavelli.
always been on a power trip. There's still that line in me. It's not interesting because I've worked it out either out in fantasy or in imagination, but it's certainly part of my nature. Not my original nature, my persona nature.
Yeah, It's, I discovered power here. I mean, Sakina was talking about how she was transformed or discovered. I was attending a meditation class with Herman Rednick one time, and he said I looked worried. I mean, I had a lot to be worried about, but this was before I was an officer or anything, and I was trying to figure it out. And I have no idea what he meant, but I was thinking about it, and I realized that I was in a position of power at Lama, and that I was unconsciously in it and uncomfortable with it. And
Which made you dangerous.
well, 2 years before, when I first met him, Ramdas had said, you know, most of the people here are working on the opening of their heart center. And it feels to me like you're working on the opening of your third chakra, which has to do with control of your environment, power, and everything. I see, and when I realized that that's what was happening, that third chakra had been opened without my even knowing it, simply because I was taking on things and finding myself, people asking me what to do, and I would tell them, and sometimes I would be very curt with them, and sort of command responsibility type. And after reflecting on what Herman had told me, I began to realize this is what happened. And I had been so rebellious against power, my father's power, I didn't like Steve's power, Barbara's power. I mean, power trips really turned me off. It was like this, the only place I could have that opening was in a place where ideally power didn't matter, but that it wasn't an issue. And so I was free somehow, unconsciously, to let that happen. And then I began to see Los Alamos as strictly a third chakra center, and I could feel, whenever I drove through, I could sort of feel this giant tinker toy that these big boys were playing with, or like boys damming up the stream because they've got to wreak their will on nature somehow or other. That's part of it. And I began to really understand what the third chakra was. And that was a real liberation. I think if I hadn't been here, I would have just been fighting it all my life. And
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah.
Lama accelerates the growth and, you know, points out to you just where the work is.
Oh, how wonderful, oh, how horrible.
Right, exactly.
Mershid used to say.
Well, it's interesting that Lama could survive after the generations of charismatic, powerful people. That it made that transition right around the time that we left. Nuruddin and Nura left. You were already gone.
I was long gone.
Yeah,
Right.
you were in Taos.
I think that's another testament to the power of the original invocation, that it could. I mean, I don't know, 7 or 8 generations of leadership now. It's extraordinary. There have been 13 coordinators, and 6 of them were here yesterday. And last year, 10 of them were here.
10 of them.
Incredible continuity. I mean, there's no organization in the world that has that kind of
Donald
continuity.
Zim died, so he
That's
won't
right.
be able to
Can't
have that coordination.
Okay, Shirin, the camera's pointing at you.
Oh,
Tell
how
us
did I
your
come?
history.
The first time I came to New Mexico was in the wintertime. I guess it was 1972, and I didn't make it up here, I don't believe. And then, but Sam Lewis had died and was buried up the hill, and he was my teacher, and so I think it was 73 when I brought my daughter here sort of on a pilgrimage to visit the grave, and of course I was in deep grief and mourning, and I was working in the garden. At that time, everybody at Lama in the summertime was nude, and we all worked with no clothes on. So I was down in the garden, completely nude, and heard this voice, which occasionally comes to me in my life, and it said, just simply move to Santa Fe. So it took me a year to get out of California, to finish up my affairs, get a divorce, get Rolfed, finish the pottery.
The Baraka pottery.
Only a year?
And she had on her, Sam had helped her, well, put it on her, because this is the hero.
Oh yes, he
She
gave me
made
an
us a
instruction.
whole.
give me an instruction to make a pottery at Lama that matched the one in Novato.
But she sent in Novato, you forget
Oh,
this
that's
all
true.
the time. The first dishes we ever ate off of were made by this woman. They were blue dishes, and it was a set of like 50 or 60
Paid by Mercia. He paid
plates,
to make them.
and cups. And it made the whole place. I mean, it
So
was
Mercia-
like an invocation
Mercia had
of good
been
eats.
here and had taught here and was very impressed with the universal vision of the fact that all religions could be honored in one place equally. He loved it. He was completely turned on by the place. He did have one comment about it, though. He said, well, if they invite a spiritual teacher, they should really let them teach.
It's always been hard for us.
Which in his mind included, regulating the day-to-day activities, but Lama wasn't willing to let him do that. So there was a bit of a struggle there, but he still totally honored the vision and wanted to be buried here, so he is. Anyway, I came and heard this voice, and it said, move to Santa Fe, and so I did. And then we were building a house, 10 of us were building this house in Santa Fe, the Conca, and for Pure Vilayat. And let's see, how did I get to Chamonix? Oh, I got to, somehow I managed to make it to Chamonix. That was the year before I moved here. During that year, I went to Chamonix as well, got all together to work. And I had met this man, Abdul Rauf, who is now running Dar al-Islam, or partly running, or somehow. And he came back to this country and was living up here with Steve Durkee as a Muslim. They were trying out the Muslim experiment at the ISC. And so after we had finished the house more or less, he came down, and Muslim weddings are supposed to just occur like mushrooms overnight, and got married. I agreed to marry him, and moved up here to the ISC in 1976 in June, and was trying to commute and teach classes down there and hang out down in Santa Fe at the same time. It didn't work out very well, so finally I was just here. And the ISC was being constructed, and the Muslim experiment was underway. And I thought, okay, I'm a Sufi, I can do this. Why not? I thought to myself. And so left some people in charge of the house and moved up here, and was here for 2 years. And built the pottery, which I don't understand what happened there. But anyway, the kiln is still there, but the pottery was gone. And struggled through what are now called the Holy Wars. And the way I look at the Holy Wars, and I had my daughter with me. She was about 6 at the time. I went to Donna House, and I spent a lot of time doing the school ride and the kid ride. And I don't know, the whole thing I learned a tremendous amount about power and control, and about my own obsessions and neuroses and tremendous needs through that experience. And then on Christmas Day, 9 months after I moved here, I left the ISC and moved to this side. There was then a fence. And what was going on, I thought, was that the Muslim experiment was becoming very orthodox. But orthodox not from a balanced perspective of the way Orthodox Islam and the rest is in the rest of the world, but again through the eyes or the interpretation of Steve Nerdy, he was then called Nerdy. And so then the whole rest of the next year was spent here in tremendous, pain and anguish as the community tried to grapple with basically what was becoming a takeover of the whole place by the Muslim community. It got pretty crazy, I think, to my mind. And so, I think and then what happened also was, I think one of the reasons I moved out was because my teacher was beginning to be slandered there. as a teacher,
Oh.
as a true Sufi.
Mhm.
And I thought, wrong.
Mhm.
And somehow my incredible compulsion and attraction to this power and control and this man in a way and his influence and my husband's buying into all of that, something snapped.
Mhm.
And I just said, this is wrong. And I moved over to this side, and so then the community here began, for months, all we could do was talk about this. It was a tremendous drain on us all psychically. Until finally, I remembered something that Murshid had said about Muhammad. And he said the way he won his wars was to play with the children by the doorstep. In other words, to give no energy at all to the supposed enemy. To simply withdraw the energy and do something positive.
Mhm.
And so every night for, maybe it was a couple times a week, we met at Jamil's teepee and just sent love indiscriminately to everyone on the property. And then when people would come up and try to talk to us about, because Steve to me was a master of taking negative energy about him. He just would love it and turn it against the person who had said it. He had an uncanny and amazing charisma and was able to, he really did understand people's psychology and was able to do amazing things with human energy. And so we just would send love and light. And then when people would come up to us to discuss the situation and get all embroiled in it, we would just say, well, we're not discussing it. If you want to join us or me in my concentration of seeing them drive down the hill, then we can sit for a minute and do that.
Uh-huh.
And then coincidentally or not, what was his name from England?
Abdul Qadir. He had invited Abdul Qadir.
He invited Abdul Qadir, who was an ego just as big, and had his own Muslim trip going.
Also had red hair. Also was a catalyst.
Right.
Also
And,
liked to stir things up.
Also liked to stir things up, and he managed to tell Nuruddin's followers that Nuruddin was not, they were not really truly living in Islam, the Islamic way. And so his followers gradually began to leave. Now this is, of course, my viewpoint on that.
Uh-huh.
Oh, and then, it was a very extremely painful time. The only thing I can think of, is why all of these, why this incredible intensity in my life and in the life of the people that I love. The only thing that my mind can manage without flipping into insanity is to think that we're all being trained for something to deal with just enormous.
Are the drums interfering too much?
Oh, Shirin's voice is a
Okay,
little soft.
good.
There was an annual meeting that should not be lost to history.
Oh yes, it was quite a
If anyone wants, I don't, was it the 10th annual meeting?
It might have been. It was sort of a nightmare for me. I had decided that I had to leave because I was close enough to Nuruddin, although we were becoming enemies in some way. However, we're probably still brothers, but we were becoming enemies at the same time. And I had decided to leave because my instinct was always to try to reconcile, and I felt that I was hurting resolution instead of helping it. The best thing I could do for Lama was to leave and let the thing work itself out, because I could only prolong it. And so that was my last meeting as coordinator. It was just so outrageous, I don't even know how to talk about it.
Yes.
It was like out of a Fellini movie.
It
the
was
stories.
surreal. It was
2.5
surreal
days.
and bitter and long-lasting and.
Well, it was also a public show.
Yeah, very bizarre.
Yes.
It was
A lot of people came up from Taos just to watch the show.
It was a
And
terrific
our
trial.
trustees because then we're all around the country flew in for it.
Several teachers sent, best wishes. I mean,
Right. We
uh,
got telegrams.
yeah, and hold the
Yeah.
fort, and
Henry
it was-
Gorman sat directly opposite Nerdine for 3 days and never said a word. He just sat there, and at the time it was before his stroke, and he was sort of taking on Grandpa Joe's, I felt, mantle in the church. And he just directed his gaze at Nerdine and just sat there for 3 days, never said a word. That was what I remember. I also remember Abdul Latif walking in a suit with a Newsweek under his arm. And
Time.
and sitting and reading the Newsweek while Nerdine all had eye makeup on and braids.
Right.
And
There were two halves of the circle. There was
Right, them.
the Muslim half and everybody else.
And Mika was directly in the middle. He was,
Right.
which was right. I mean, it was right on. It was
They
observed
faced
at the
Mecca.
time.
At that point, what they
Oh,
thought
right.
Mecca was, they had their rug set up.
But,
It was a
Yeah.
square rug in the octagonal room, which also made it.
One of my
was,
most interesting experiences at Lama was in preparation for that meeting. Siddiq and Joe Jackson and David Powelson and I went to visit the trustees
a pilgrimage.
in New Mexico. Started with Jonathan Altman, who didn't want to have anything to do with the whole thing.
Yeah.
Kind of looked at us like this. Then spent a night with David Padua, and then a night at the Bodhi with Michelle.
And
And
Roshi
it
was there, and we went to his Tasha the next morning. I'm interrupting. And he gave a Tasha, and he said, he said something to the effect that we sometimes say in Buddhism there is no God, but we also say there is no flower, and we also say there is no self.
Oh.
And and it was Joe who pointed that out to me later. I didn't catch it at the time, and I understood that to say that there is a self and there is no God is blasphemy, but to say there is no God can only follow if you say there is no me, no you, no building, no flower, no
concept.
no world, and only then does there is no God make. Can it be said?
And
with
so
any kind of
yes,
integrity?
somehow it was interesting. And one of the point, there was this Quran spread open on the rug in front of, and then a little ways down the line there was this Newsweek. And then at one point, there was one point where, was it you? I don't remember exactly what happened. Nerdine, in a tremendous anger, got up and left. And then when he came back, he was another personality altogether.
Well, the reason I went to Virginia was that Siddiq and Nuruddin had leveled off at each other at one point. I mean, I had come because I was looking for the next step for myself and these 4 children. They didn't want to be little hippies anymore. They wanted to be
Something
no pets.
happened in the meeting
So there
that
was
changed
this-
the internet. I think it was you.
No,
wasn't it?
here's what happened. I think this is what happened, is that you were just completely frustrated. I mean, he got in your anger demon up, but you, personality-wise, there was no way you were going to really do it, so you were still kind of muffled in terms of coming back equally. And he was doing his full-fledged lightning bolt thing at you, but it was by this
I was
time
doing
it had been so observed, right? I mean, that it did look like a kind of a parody, but he had gotten to the point where he was more rude than he was fascinating, right? I mean, that his rudeness had then taken over.
His charisma had gone.
And Saul was there, and Saul was standing by the fireplace, and Saul said, "In the name of Allah, Steve."
I remember that.
And I'm not sure whether he said be polite, or pay attention to Allah, or pull yourself together, but the way he said that, he had just taken me out to this large dinner because he wanted me to move back east with him. And I saw him do that, and it changed the whole energy of the dome. And somehow he got through to Steve. And I saw him do that, and I thought, guess I'll go to Virginia. I mean, because I figured like I had been with this vision for a really long time, and this was really outrageous, whatever there was happening there. And somehow it was like he really wanted me to go. I mean, he bought me a really expensive meal at the tennis ranch, and nobody had taken me out to dinner, and gotten the best wine and all of that. And that didn't, I was still waiting, thinking, what shall I do? And then when he did that, I realized that Saul had some kind of straight way, and he wasn't afraid of breaking through or having anything. He didn't care what happened to him. He was tapped in at that moment to really, such a clear place. It was great.
Another thing I remember about that meeting, I think it was the morning of the third day. By then, Jamil had sort of taken on the mantle of being the next coordinator. It was clear that we were leaving, and he very reluctantly was, stepping into this role. And we adjourned the meeting to have a discussion of, we were talking about, coming up with a deal of some sort. And a bunch of us came into the library, and we discussed and came up. We were looking for a lightning bolt from God to tell us what to do. Yeah, we talked for half an hour or so, and came to some agreement about what to say. And Jamil was going to be the spokesperson. When we went back out, formed one circle again, and Jamil said something completely different from what we had agreed on. And I thought, I just started laughing. I thought, oh God, this is the lightning bolt,
I don't remember it.
It was really interesting. It was like a complete disorganization of these sort of mushy hearts and good intentions
And people who did not have a strong practice, because I'm just saying that as
That
a
was
position.
the accusation against
That
us.
was the position of the people, of Nuruddin and whatever he was representing.
But we still
But
won.
it was not true.
Well, there is no winning.
Well, in the sense of preserving the
In my
foundations of...
reality, there was no winning
Well, there
for
wasn't
sure.
me. I'm sorry.
No
In the
winners.
in the sense of preserving the foundation's original intention.
Yeah.
We did, somehow. And it was through the most disorganized, well-intentioned bunch of strange folks. And then...
Beans, Lama beans.
And, I mean, it was amazing. And in fact, I thought it was all over, certainly. Because if power is what is right, then certainly they should have won. In a sense, or they
What
should have
turned it
taken
for
over the
me? What turned it
foundation.
for me was when we had met in the dewdrop, and we decided, okay, we'll give it to him, change the name, and we'll split. And we went over and we met with them, and we told him that, and he turned pale. He blanched.
You're kidding, that happened?
Yes, that happened, and he blanched.
You're kidding, I
That
can't
was the
believe
turning
that
point.
happened.
That was before the annual meeting.
Oh, it was?
Yeah, and
Wow.
and that, I mean, in retrospect, it was like he wanted it, and yet he knew it was more than he could handle. It was like the will and the angels.
But
were
also, see, he
disparate.
fed on the drama. And if he didn't have the drama, he had no source of power in some psychological
So
way.
he wasn't given to take what we were ready to give him. I mean, abdicating our responsibility.
I can't
We were-
believe
We
that.
were
I
ready to
didn't
give
know
up.
that.
He blanched. You were there. Joe
I
was
was
there. Yeah, you were there.
You
Joe
said,
was
we'll
there, Sakina
leave and
was
you can
Well,
have the whole
I have
to
thing.
tell you
And
another-
you didn't take it?
And
There
he
was something
blanched.
that occurred.
What did he say?
I actually was involved in a
turned
trial. In a trial that they were going to stone me for adultery.
Oh my God.
And sort of after that point, I had gone completely into,
I don't believe that was the case, but
well, I mean, it was funny. What occurred to me, see, in relation to this whole power trip, is that I forgot that I was an American. This is after, living as a Muslim. I forgot that I had civil liberties, honestly. And also, my daughter had been molested in Taos the night before this trial. And I remember that I went so far into myself. And so I think this is why I don't remember this meeting. I was literally, I had withdrawn, I just became completely singly focused on this guy leaving the foundation and somehow preserving my own sanity and my own integrity as a human being. But in the middle of this trial, my ex-husband at the time, although he still felt he had control of him, asked me if I was a Muslim, and I remember I looked at him, I mean, from this place of incredible, and this is sort of an irony, this, I can't describe it. In times of great crisis, I just withdraw this energy into myself and become, no matter what happens, it's okay, whatever happens, but I'm alive. And I looked at him and I said, I'm not a Muslim. I'm a Buddhist, a Zen Buddhist. And at that point, the law didn't apply anymore. It was fascinating.
It was. That was the most
Fascinating.
painful time of my life. I think that was the most painful day I've ever experienced in terms of the heart. Because Shirin asked me to be a representative for her. And then Abdul Rauf and Abdul, what's his name? Abdullah, who was from Albuquerque. And,
I don't
and suddenly
remember
it was my position to judge.
Oh,
Suddenly
yes.
I was.
The Muslims made him into the judge as
Oh God,
representative
such archetype roles.
of the
Yeah.
coordinator.
What a weird setup.
And I could have refused
It was sick.
outright.
Sick.
And in
I was-
retrospect,
He knew Machiavelli much better than I thought.
Oh.
in retrospect, I could have just refused the whole thing. But I was concerned about the survival of the Lama.
Right.
Yeah.
So he was in this incredible position,
And
and I just felt betrayed by everybody.
Yeah.
Because the reason I was being accused of adultery was we were getting a divorce because he wanted to marry somebody. And he sent this note over and said we had been like not sleeping with each other for 2 weeks because we were getting a divorce. But meanwhile, he wanted to marry his present wife. And I said, great, go for it. But under Muslim law, the wife is supposed to abstain for like 30 to 60 days or something like this. I figured this
He
guy's
was getting
married.
married so that he can make love with her.
Yeah. So I don't know. But anyway.
No, they were going to marry him to Margaret.
Well, whatever. That's another story. That's a whole
There are
nother
many stories.
saga. There's
many
stories.
unbelievable
And
stories.
Sarah's
And so
probably
I
here to
felt-
call us to the 21st annual
I'm
meeting.
free.
Yeah, we should
Or
go.
Is this the 20th?
23rd.
23rd.
Okay,
All
so
right.
we have to break it up.
Thank you, Marigold.
To be
Thanks,
continued
Marigold.
next
To be
year. or-
continued.
Thank you all, really. This is precious, priceless meeting of hearts and minds and souls.
We're just ending there. Well, it's an ongoing saga.
What do you mean
We'll never
ending
end.
there? We're right here.
Look, we could spend 100 years telling these stories.
Besides, it's 10 years ago. I mean,